In 102 BC, the valleys of southern Gaul trembled under the relentless march of over 100,000 Germanic warriors intent on crossing the Alps and annihilating the Roman Republic. But at Aquae Sextiae, the migrating Teutones and Ambrones did not find a terrified, disorganized militia waiting for inevitable destruction. Instead, they found Supreme Commander Gaius Marius and a meticulously engineered topographic trap. Rome had already lost tens of thousands of men in previous military disasters, making this desperate campaign the Republic's absolute final stand. If the legions failed here, the capital would undoubtedly burn. Yet, rather than meeting the vastly superior enemy numbers on the open plains, where sheer mass would dictate the outcome, Marius fundamentally altered the geometry of the battlefield. He utilized the steep, punishing gradient of a carefully selected hill, weaponized calculated water deprivation, and deployed a hidden detachment of 3,000 heavy infantrymen to turn a standard defensive position into an inescapable execution block. The heavy, metallic discipline of the Roman line stood motionless on the crest, their locked shields reflecting the harsh sunlight as they waited for gravity and physical exhaustion to break the momentum of the tribal charge. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the Battle of Aquae Sextiae, exploring the sweeping Marian reforms, the fatal uphill charge, and the brilliant tactical ambush that saved Western civilization. But to understand how this massive slaughter was orchestrated, we must first look at the unparalleled terror that forced Rome to hand absolute power to one man. In 105 BC, the Roman Republic suffered a demographic hemorrhage at the Battle of Arausio. Two consular armies were entirely annihilated by the migrating Cimbri and Teutones, leaving an estimated 80,000 Roman legionaries and allied auxiliaries dead on the banks of the Rhone River. The sheer scale of the defeat did not merely cause political instability, it triggered an existential paralysis. When the catastrophic casualty lists were finally read aloud in the Roman Forum, an oppressive, silent dread gripped the capital, as citizens realized that the vast majority of their trained fighting force had been erased in a single afternoon. The Republic was suddenly devoid of capable manpower, and the Alpine passes to northern Italy lay wide open. The Senate, an institution fundamentally defined by its rigid adherence to aristocratic tradition and cautious legal precedent, recognized that strictly following the old constitutional rules would result in the complete extermination of the state. To survive, the political establishment was forced to turn to an outsider. Gaius Marius was a new man, a novus homo of non-noble birth from the provincial town of Arpinum. He lacked the ancient pedigree and the ancestral marble masks of the patrician elite, but he compensated for his lack of political heritage with sheer, unyielding military competence. Marius had already proven his tactical brilliance by decisively ending the grueling, decades-long Jugurthine War in North Africa. Viewing him as the only pragmatic shield against an apocalyptic threat, the desperate Roman populace deliberately shattered centuries of constitutional law. They elected Marius to the consulship, the highest executive office in the Republic, not just once, but year after year, in unprecedented succession. He was handed supreme command of the northern frontier, not because the entrenched aristocracy favored him, but because they recognized he was the only general capable of functioning as a ruthless military architect rather than a negotiating politician. As supreme commander, Marius refused to immediately march out and engage the tribes in a blind bid for revenge. He was a cold, methodical calculator of military logistics, and his initial assessment of the Republic's surviving defenses revealed a fatal structural flaw. The traditional Roman army was a militia composed exclusively of property-owning citizens, designed for men who left their farms for a brief summer campaign before returning to harvest their crops. However, the Germanic tribes were not a conventional border threat. They were a massive, moving nation of hundreds of thousands, completely unconstrained by agricultural cycles. The old Roman recruitment system was too slow, too fragile, and completely depleted of eligible, wealthy landowners. Facing an enemy that had already wiped out a generation of soldiers, Marius realized that the traditional Roman war machine was obsolete, and he was about to completely rebuild it from the ground up, to forge a force capable of absorbing the Germanic tides. Gaius Marius dismantled the centuries-old property requirements for military service. He opened the ranks of the legions to the capite censi, the landless, destitute masses of Rome, who previously had no stake in the Republic's wars. This was a radical political shift, transforming the Roman military from a seasonal citizen militia into a permanent, professional standing army. These men did not return to farms in the autumn. The legion became their home, their career, and their sole source of income. By offering regular pay, future land grants upon retirement, and a share of the spoils, Marius secured a level of absolute, unbroken loyalty that the Senate had never before commanded. With this new foundation of manpower, the Supreme Commander initiated a ruthless standardization of equipment and tactical doctrine. Previously, soldiers purchased their own gear, resulting in a chaotic, uneven mix of armor and weapons across the battle line. Marius centralized supply, issuing every heavy infantryman the exact same operational kit. This included the large curved scutum shield, the deadly Gladius short sword, and the pilum, a heavy javelin engineered to bend upon impact so the enemy could not throw it back. The Roman legionary was systematically stripped of individual battlefield heroism and reprogrammed into a synchronized component of a massive metallic grinding machine. The sharp, metallic clang of standardized iron hammering against wooden training posts echoed relentlessly through the staging camps as Marius drilled his men until their tactical responses became pure muscle memory. Yet, the most revolutionary adjustment was not in weaponry, but in military logistics. Ancient armies were historically tethered to massive, slow-moving baggage trains pulled by oxen, which severely restricted daily marching speed and offered a highly vulnerable target for enemy ambush. Marius pragmatically eliminated the bulk of these cumbersome carts. He ordered his men to carry their own survival and engineering equipment on a specialized forked pole resting on their shoulders. Each legionary hauled roughly 60 pounds of gear, including iron rations, a cooking pot, a saw, an axe, and heavy wooden palisade stakes for camp construction. The grueling physical friction of marching 20 miles a day while bearing this heavy timber and iron cut deeply into the shoulders of the infantrymen, earning them the grim, enduring nickname of Marius's Mules. This brutal daily conditioning erased the physical fragility of the urban recruits, leaving behind an army defined by immense stamina and cold, unyielding discipline. Stripped of their slow baggage trains, the legions could now march faster, dig deeper, and deploy quicker than any force in Roman history. These newly forged, hardened veterans were eager to test their steel, but their supreme commander was about to demand the one thing they hated most: absolute inaction. As the vanguard of the Teutones finally materialized in southern Gaul, Marius anchored his newly reformed legions within a heavily fortified encampment near the banks of the Rhone River. The Germanic host expected the Romans to march out and offer a pitched battle on the open plains, just as previous consuls had done to their own ruin at Arausio. Instead, the supreme commander ordered his men to stand down behind the earthen ramparts. Deprived of a direct confrontation, the immense migrating tribal column simply bypassed the Roman position. For 6 consecutive days, the staggering mass of over 100,000 enemy combatants, accompanied by their families and heavy wagons, marched past the fortifications. The Germanic warriors hurled relentless insults at the palisades, mockingly offering to carry messages back to the Roman wives they intended to enslave. The psychological friction within the camp was immense. The heavily armed legionaries burned with humiliated rage, gripping their standard-issue weapons and demanding the order to attack. Yet Marius maintained supreme psychological control, deliberately using the enemy's daily taunts to forge a cold, mechanical anger that would guarantee absolute, unquestioning obedience when he finally chose the ground. Only when the massive enemy column had completely cleared the area did Marius break camp, transitioning his forces into a relentless shadow operation. The Roman legions trailed the Germanic host closely, meticulously maintaining their marching columns along elevated, defensible ridges to completely neutralize any threat of a sudden ambush from the surrounding tree lines. The operational objective was not mere pursuit, but the systematic selection of a topographic execution block. This calculated shadowing brought both armies to the vicinity of Aquae Sextiae, a valley defined by its uneven terrain and regional thermal springs. Here, Marius identified the exact geographic anchor he required to dismantle the tribal momentum. He directed his officers to construct the final Roman encampment at the crest of a prominent, steep hill that dominated the valley floor, locking the enemy into his field of view. This elevated position was a masterclass in defensive terrain selection. The steep gradient of the hill was mathematically engineered to neutralize the primary tactical advantage of the Germanic tribes, the sheer kinetic impact of their massed infantry charge. By forcing the Teutones to advance uphill over broken ground, Marius ensured that gravity would strip away their momentum, severely exhaust their warriors, and leave them highly vulnerable to the devastating penetrative power of a downward Roman pilum volley. However, this brilliant topographic advantage contained a glaring, potentially fatal logistical flaw. The crest of the hill lacked any immediate access to a fresh water source. The only reliable supply of water flowed through the valley floor directly below the Roman position, a crucial resource area already occupied by the sprawling vanguard camp of the Ambrones and Teutones. The legionaries were already suffering from severe dehydration after executing a rapid, armored, forced march under the punishing Mediterranean sun. When the soldiers complained of their thirst, Marius reportedly pointed toward the river flowing through the enemy lines, coldly stating that their drinking water would have to be purchased with blood. He had deliberately engineered a scenario where his men would fight with the absolute desperation of survival. The Supreme Commander had secured the high ground, but placing his thirsty men above a river controlled by the enemy virtually guaranteed that a localized skirmish would ignite a massive escalation. The friction ignited almost immediately. Driven by severe dehydration, a detachment of Roman camp servants and Ligurian auxiliaries descended the steep slope toward the riverbank to draw water. They moved directly into the immediate perimeter of the Ambrones, the vanguard faction of the Germanic host, who were currently utilizing the valley's thermal springs and river for bathing and preparing meals. What began as a desperate localized scramble for water access rapidly deteriorated into a violent, uncoordinated melee. The sudden shouts of alarm and the clatter of hastily drawn iron echoed up the valley walls, instantly alerting the Roman encampment positioned on the crest of the hill. Recognizing that his light skirmishers were heavily outnumbered and at risk of being overrun, Marius allowed the escalation. He dispatched elite cohorts of heavy infantry to reinforce the riverbank. The Ambrones, roused by the commotion, grabbed their weapons and attempted to form a cohesive battle line, chanting the name of their tribe to build psychological momentum. However, they were reacting to an unfolding crisis rather than executing a planned assault. When the Roman veteran infantry arrived at the bottom of the slope, they did not engage in the individualized, heroic combat favored by the Germanic warriors. Instead, they maintained absolute unit discipline, executing a synchronized forward press. The sudden shock of cold river water churned brown with silt and blood as the Roman heavy infantry locked their shields and drove their weight into the disorganized tribal ranks. The tactical reality of the riverbed heavily favored the Marian legions. The uneven, muddy ground and the rushing current stripped the Ambrones of their footing and prevented them from utilizing the full swinging arc of their long swords. Conversely, the Roman legionaries, protected by their interlocking walls of wood and bronze, used their short gladii with mechanical, thrusting efficiency in the tight press. The Germanic vanguard was systematically dismantled. Pushed backward into the water, the Ambrones broke under the relentless pressure and attempted to retreat to the opposite bank. The Romans pursued them through the shallows, cutting down thousands of fleeing warriors and effectively neutralizing the entire vanguard as a functional military entity. By securing the water source, Marius had achieved his primary logistical objective while simultaneously inflicting a devastating psychological blow on the enemy. The surviving Ambrones fled back to the safety of their wagons, and the Roman cohorts methodically withdrew back up the steep gradient to their fortified hilltop, their canteens full and their discipline proven. The vanguard was completely shattered, but as night fell, the heavy, rhythmic war chants echoing from the valley floor signaled that the massive main host of the Teutones was preparing to unleash hell at dawn. Despite the immediate tension following the river skirmish, the anticipated dawn assault did not materialize. For 3 agonizing days, the main host of the Teutones remained encamped, prioritizing the consolidation of their scattered tribal contingents and assessing the vanguard that had been destroyed in the shallows. This operational pause granted Marius the precise window of time he required to construct the second hidden mechanism of his topographic trap. The Supreme Commander knew that while the steep gradient of Aquae Sextiae heavily favored his professional infantry, absorbing the concentrated kinetic mass of over 100,000 Germanic warriors in a strictly frontal engagement remained a mathematical gamble that could guarantee the total eradication of the enemy force. Rather than merely repelling a localized assault, he needed an anvil to lock the migrating column in place and a hammer to shatter their structural integrity from behind. In the dead of night, Marius detached a specialized force of 3,000 veteran heavy infantry under the command of his trusted officer, Gaius Marcellus. Their orders dictated an exceptionally high-risk nocturnal flanking maneuver. Stripped of their cumbersome marching packs but still carrying their standard iron mail and heavy weaponry, the detachment slipped quietly out of the hilltop fortifications. They navigated the dense, wooded ridges that flanked the eastern edge of the valley, relying entirely on the heavy timber canopy to mask their movement from the thousands of enemy sentries watching the high ground. Moving 3,000 armored men through unbroken vegetation in absolute darkness demanded an unparalleled level of unit discipline, knowing that a single dropped scutum shield or misplaced step on dry underbrush would immediately betray their position to the tribal host below. By the time the sun rose, Marcellus had successfully bypassed the enemy perimeter and entrenched his men deep in the forest directly behind the main staging ground of the Teutones. They were now completely invisible to the valley floor, under strict orders to endure the psychological strain of waiting in silence until the main engagement was irreversibly committed. However, this deployment carried an immense operational vulnerability. By splitting his already heavily outnumbered army, Marius had intentionally weakened his primary defensive line on the crest of the hill. If the Germanic charge managed to overwhelm the Marian cohorts and breach the summit fortifications before Marcellus received the signal to advance, the 3,000 isolated men in the forest would be permanently severed from their command structure, surrounded in hostile territory and systematically hunted down. The anvil was securely in place on the summit, and the hammer was hidden perfectly in the trees. But the entire blueprint relied on the Teutones making a fatal, impatient miscalculation. That fatal miscalculation arrived with the rising sun. Driven by the humiliation of their vanguard's destruction in the riverbed and confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, the Teutones abandoned all tactical restraint. Rather than blockading the Roman water supply or attempting to starve the legions out of their fortifications, the Germanic chieftains ordered a direct, massed frontal assault against the entrenched Roman camp. To reach the Marian lines, tens of thousands of tribal warriors had to sprint up the steep, punishing gradient of Aquae Sextiae. From a purely mechanical standpoint, this command decision doomed the offensive before a single sword was ever swung. The sheer kinetic energy of a Germanic tribal charge, historically their most devastating psychological and tactical asset, was entirely neutralized by the uncompromising physics of the incline. Every step taken up the rugged slope drained their stamina, forcing the warriors to fight gravity long before they ever reached Roman steel. At the crest of the hill, the Roman heavy infantry stood in absolute, terrifying silence. Marius explicitly forbade his men from breaking formation or throwing their weapons prematurely, demanding rigid adherence to their new tactical doctrine. The legionaries watched the massive human tide surge upward, holding their ground until the exhausted attackers crossed into the lethal kill zone, a designated distance of barely 15 paces. Upon the Supreme Commander's order, the front ranks unleashed a synchronized volley of pila. The air vibrated with the sudden sharp hiss of thousands of heavy iron-tipped javelins descending at point-blank range. The Roman pilum was specifically engineered for this exact tactical scenario, its soft iron shank bent upon piercing an enemy's wooden shield, making it impossible to extract or throw back. A Germanic warrior attempting to advance with a heavy Roman javelin dragging from his shield was functionally paralyzed, forcing thousands to discard their wooden protection entirely and face the Roman line with bare chests. Stripped of their kinetic momentum and their primary defense, the Teutones crashed into the Roman front line. There was no grand, heroic melee, but rather a brutal, structural collision of physics and discipline. The Romans locked their curved scuta together, forming a solid, overlapping wall of wood and bronze that was perfectly anchored on the high ground. Behind this impenetrable barrier, the legionaries operated with cold, mechanical efficiency, thrusting their short gladii into the exposed bodies of the disorganized attackers. The steep terrain strictly dictated the geometry of the slaughter. The Germanic warriors, forced to strike upward from a lower elevation, lost the leverage required to deliver lethal, cleaving blows with their long swords. Their strikes glanced harmlessly off the tops of the Roman shields, while the legionaries struck downward with maximum penetrative force. As the engagement ground on under the Mediterranean sun, the environmental pressure of Aquae Sextiae began to systematically dismantle the tribal host. The Teutones were expending massive amounts of physical energy, simply trying to maintain their footing on the steep, uneven incline. Here, the Marian reforms truly manifested their value. The capite sensi, men who had spent months hauling 60 pounds of equipment on their shoulders during relentless forced marches, possessed a reservoir of physical endurance that the tribal warriors simply could not match. Recognizing the enemy's rapidly depleting stamina, Marius ordered the Roman line to advance. The heavy infantry executed a relentless, synchronized forward step, actively weaponizing the downward slope. By leveraging their own body weight and the pull of gravity, the legionaries physically bulldozed the tribal front ranks backward. The Germanic formation, lacking the rigid internal structure of the Roman cohorts, began to compress and fracture as the exhausted frontline warriors were shoved violently back into their own advancing reserves. What began as an aggressive, overwhelming tribal assault had devolved into a desperate, backpedaling struggle for survival. The Teutones were slowly being pushed back down toward the valley floor, their command structure unraveling as individual warriors slipped, fell, and were trampled under the relentless, downward march of the Marian heavy infantry. The Germanic lines were buckling from absolute physical exhaustion, entirely consumed by the methodical wall of iron descending upon them from above. But they had no idea that the true killing blow was about to strike them from the one direction they believed was safe. The grueling attrition on the hillside had drawn the entirety of the Germanic combat power into a singular, forward-facing struggle. It was precisely at this moment of maximum tribal compression that Claudius Marcellus received the signal to advance. For hours, his 3,000 heavy infantrymen had maintained absolute, unnatural silence within the heavy timberline, watching the enemy reserves funnel forward to feed the collapsing front line. Then, the piercing, metallic blast of Roman cornua, the heavy brass horns of the legions, violently shattered the roar of the frontline melee. The hidden detachment erupted from the forest canopy, their weapons drawn and their formation tightly packed. They did not pause to reform or shout battle cries. They immediately launched a devastating downhill charge, driving their massed momentum straight into the completely unprotected rear echelon of the enemy host. In the mechanics of ancient infantry warfare, the structural integrity of any formation relies absolutely on the security of its flanks and rear. A warrior's shield only protects his front, and his courage is heavily dependent on the presence of allies guarding his back. When the tribal fighters engaged on the slope realized that Roman forces were actively cutting through their own rear lines, their collective cohesion evaporated in an instant. The psychological shock of Marcellus's sudden appearance triggered an immediate, cascading panic throughout the Germanic ranks. The Teutones, already physically drained from the uphill assault and the grinding Roman counterpush, suddenly found themselves physically trapped in a rapidly closing vice. There was no time to turn their ranks, issue new orders, or organize a secondary defensive line. The tribal command structure, which relied heavily on localized momentum and the visible presence of frontline chieftains, suffered a total and irreversible disintegration. Caught between the relentless downward pressure of Marius's main army and the violent kinetic impact of the hidden detachment, the Germanic warriors were systematically annihilated. The tactical mechanism of the hammer and anvil functioned flawlessly, crushing the disorganized masses between two converging walls of standardized iron. Thousands of tribal fighters threw down their long swords and wooden shields in a desperate, uncoordinated bid to escape the encirclement, only to be cut down by the advancing cohorts or trampled by their own terrified comrades. The once unstoppable migrating column dissolved into a chaotic, fragmented mob, desperately seeking a non-existent exit from the valley floor. During this rapid, structural collapse, the tribal leadership was completely neutralized. Teutones, the towering chieftain of the Teutones who had led the terrifying migration across Europe and orchestrated the slaughter of previous Roman armies, found his personal guard overwhelmed. Rather than dying in a glorious final stand, the chieftain was surrounded, subdued, and captured alive by the pursuing Roman forces. His capture physically cemented the decapitation of the Germanic threat, stripping the remaining survivors of any unifying figure to rally around. The destruction of the tribal leadership ensured that the fleeing remnants could not regroup or mount a secondary offensive. By the time the sun set over Aquae Sextiae, the carefully engineered topographic trap had achieved its horrific mathematical conclusion. The combined forces of the Teutones and Ambrones had been entirely erased from the map, leaving tens of thousands of bodies littering the valley. Marius had successfully weaponized the terrain, operational patience, and his newly professionalized legions to execute one of the most decisive encirclements in military history. The immediate existential threat to the Italian peninsula was permanently neutralized, but the political ramifications of this unprecedented victory would soon plunge the Republic into a far deadlier conflict. The sheer scale of the slaughter at Aquae Sextiae in 102 BC shocked even the hardened military observers of the ancient world. Over 100,000 Teutones and Ambrones were systematically killed or shackled into slavery, effectively erasing an entire migrating nation from the European map. The regional geography was permanently altered by the carnage. Historical records note that the valley soil was so heavily saturated with human remains that it produced unnaturally massive agricultural harvests in the following years, and the discarded bones of the Germanic warriors were eventually gathered by local farmers to construct vineyard fences. The immediate existential terror that had paralyzed Rome since the disaster at Arausio evaporated. When official dispatches of the victory reached the capital, the Senate and the populace erupted in a frenzy of relief. Gaius Marius, the provincial outsider whom the aristocracy had previously despised, was universally hailed as the third founder of Rome. He had not merely won a battle, he had fundamentally rescued Western civilization from the brink of total demographic replacement. The legions had proven that standardized engineering, rigid unit discipline, and absolute mastery of topographic positioning could entirely dismantle the kinetic mass of a numerically superior foe. Yet, the very mechanism that secured this monumental salvation also embedded a fatal systemic flaw into the foundation of the Roman state. By eliminating the property requirements for military service, Marius had transformed the legions from a patriotic citizen militia into a professional standing army. These landless veterans did not look to the abstract, distant authority of the Senate for their livelihood. They looked exclusively to their supreme commander. Marius had to secure land and spoils for his troops through political force, legally tying the financial survival of the army directly to the success of its general. The Roman legion was no longer a temporary instrument of the Republic. It had become a permanent, private client army. The heavy thud of silver coins distributed by a commanding officer now carried far more political weight than any ancient decree issued from the Senate floor. This fundamental shift in military loyalty initiated a catastrophic geopolitical realignment. Marius had forged a weapon capable of breaking the Germanic tides, but he inadvertently wrote the blueprint for the Republic's ultimate destruction. Within a single generation, the ambitious officers who learned their trade under his command, men like Lucius Cornelius Sulla and eventually Julius Caesar, would realize that whoever commanded the absolute loyalty of the legions also commanded the ultimate authority over Rome itself. The victory at Aquae Sextiae preserved the Roman borders from foreign invasion, but it permanently fractured the internal political consensus, guaranteeing that the deadliest enemies the legions would face in the coming decades would be other Romans. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together, and join us for the next chapter of World Chronicles.